I see Hoko was admitted to the emergency room a little over a year ago. Officer Hawthorne stares at Cassius with the intensity of something fathomless and dead. Something like Hoko. Like the sickening gray concrete walls of the small interrogation room. Empty, lifeless, silent, gray. Mr. Abaddon. Hawthorne's voice pulls Cassius from the confines of his thoughts and back to this nauseating room. He clears his throat, the sound like sandpaper. I don't see what the car accident has to do with her death. Hosoko's final moments are still raw, the wound a gaping mess of red in his memory. The image of her body, ramrod straight as she leaned over the edge of the apartment balcony, the twist of her limbs on the concrete below, the pounding in his head and chest. From so high up, he could see her swollen stomach was now limp, like a yolk broken from its egg, her midnight hair haloed in a smatter of dark blood on the asphalt. Black, haloed in red. A brief flash of the painting in his apartment flickers across his mind. He remembers those specific paint strokes. A black, bottomless circle outlined in crimson. The image belongs to the eyes of a portrait currently sitting in his home studio, miles from where he is now. A portrait that was the source of his personal hell for the better part of the last year. Painting used to be an escape for Cassius, and he found the silence as he worked soothing. But the night Hoko announced she was pregnant, that all changed. He sat down to an empty canvas, and what came out of the brush strokes wasn't what he intended, though he wasn't sure what it was. The mess of blues and violets, blacks and grays, had no real shape, and yet its formlessness was grotesque and carried a sense of a pulse, of something living. Still, he continued to work on it, but stopped when he realized his precious silence had been replaced by a two-toned, inhuman laughter that filled the room to the point where he felt he would disappear inside of it. Panicked, he scoured the room for the source of the laughter, but there was nothing, and no way to dim it. The less time he spent painting, the louder it got, so we painted. For months it continued this way, beginning when he sat down to work on the portrait. The laughter commanded him to perfect the eyes, the black haloed in red, rising to a skull-stabbing pitch when he made even the slightest mistake. Hours later, when he made the final stroke, the cacophony of noise retreated, satisfied for the night with his work. He basked in the silence, relieved and shaking, but knowing he only had hours until it returned to haunt him again. At least it's gone now, Cassius thinks. The endless laughter that had stalked him for months was silenced the moment Hoko hit the pavement. The officer clears his throat, staring at Cassius with narrowed eyes. A beat passes between them as the detective sizes up what Cassius imagines must look like a cold, soulless man. Maybe he is soulless. What he feels more than anything right now is a lack of everything. The record says Hoko had severe trauma to her abdominal area after the car accident caused the miscarriage. Cassius knows this already, and doesn't see what it has to do with her death. The car accident was over a year and a half ago, and he remembers arriving at the hospital just as one of the nurses carried a lifeless bundle out of the room and away from Hoko. They shared a moment of emptiness then, because that was when Cassius had lost everything. When pregnant with their first child, before the miscarriage, Hosoko's womb had been the only color his eyes could see, the only source for his inspiration. It hadn't been like that when she'd first announced her pregnancy, but as the child grew stronger, it seemed to suck the living color from Cassius's world until the unborn hoarded it all inside itself, leaving the rest of the world a flat, dead gray. He had watched the entire light spectrum dance on Hosoko's stomach just months before the accident with awe. Seeing the lights and unnameable hues fade back to gray in the nurse's arms was almost unbearable. Cassius felt his insides sink, heavy with sadness. His whole world was gray after that. No color to break the monotony. Hoko remained silent in her hospital bed, just staring straight ahead, eyes wide open as if she were watching a playback of the accident. Cassius preferred the quiet. He didn't know what to say to her. He didn't know how to ask why she hadn't looked both ways before crossing the road. He couldn't form the words. They dried on his tongue like a drop of water in the desert. But he thought it over and over, wishing she would answer his thoughts. How could you let my colors fade? Mr. Abaddon. Officer Hawthorne opens his mouth to speak and hesitates once before continuing, tiptoeing over every carefully chosen word. I think you should know that it wasn't an accident. The officer pulls a roll of paper from his back pocket and tosses it onto the table in front of Cassius, watching him cautiously. Cassius stares down at the papers, unsure of what they are or what they have to do with the miscarriage. Meaning. The officer swallows hard and merely gestures again to the papers. He glances at them, not really reading, but a pang of recognition forces his eyes to stop. The pages are littered with Hoko's handwriting, dates marking the top of each page, journal entries. He doesn't remember ever seeing Hoko write in a journal. He reads a highlighted portion to himself. Blonde hair's everywhere. Sometimes I think I see a blonde hair growing out of his dark head, like she's infected him, made her way inside. The idea makes me sick, like the scent of her perfume on him, something so sweet it turns sour on my tongue. He's failed to hide the lies from my ears. The tremor, the slight slip in his voice when he says words, business trip, or home a little late has never fooled me. But I can't lose Cassius to her when his child beats at me from the inside. A part of his soul is in this child, and another part with me. 2 is balanced, calm, eternal, but he has cut off a portion for her. 3 is chaotic, unbalanced, and destructive. So, I will put his soul back together so he can remember where it belongs. I will no longer be one with a man who has split his soul into 3. The words that fall from Cassius's mouth are insignificant, because they don't change anything now. She walked into traffic on purpose. She wanted the baby to die. The officer doesn't offer condolences, merely continues as if Cassius hadn't said anything at all. Mr. Abaddon, where were you when Hoko was hit by that car? Cassius feels the officer's words echoing in his hollow body like tire screeches, but he answers above all the internal noise. Telling the blonde it was over. The silence that follows is so peaceful, he can almost feel his soul breathe again, like an ocean wave overwhelming the shore. He pushes it away, though, not ready to connect with his soul again. Right now, he just wants to forget. You ended the affair, but obviously that didn't last. It isn't a question. Cassius nods. When he met the blonde, Hoko had been only a month along, but that was before the unborn child sucked all the color from the world, when Hoko still resembled a gray corpse. But the blonde's hair was like white sunshine, her eyes such a bright blue it made the skies envious. She was life and breath and air all rolled into one, and she was stunning. But around Hoko's 3rd month, he noticed the blonde's platinum locks turning a sickening silver. He realized after another month or so where all the color was being harbored, and turned his attention to his unborn child, mesmerized by its brilliancy. Ironically, the day he broke up with the blonde, His light and inspiration was snuffed out like a small flame. He supposes on some level it's what he deserved, the universe serving him its form of twisted justice for his disloyalty. After that, his heart had no more room for feeling. I should have left her after that. This thought circles his insides, and Cassius feels his heart pulse hard once, like it's agreeing with him. I should have left her. Mr. Abaddon. Cassius stares at Hawthorne, realizing the echoes have escaped through his lips. I should have left, he repeats, knowing he cannot reveal the real reason he wanted to leave, because it is useless to explain his color vision to a man who sees the world through a normal lens. I was going to leave Hoko a few months after the miscarriage. I had no more ties with her. The real meaning behind his words tugs at his heart with sadness. She stole my color with her stupidity, and I hated her for it. But you stayed. I had to. The officer raises a skeptical eyebrow at him. And why's that? Cassius studies Hawthorne for a moment before answering. She became pregnant again. I couldn't sever ties with her after that. The officer shrugs. Why not? I see it all the time. Single mothers abandoned by their boyfriends. Surely you thought about leaving her even after she became pregnant again. Of course he'd thought about it, but it was impossible. Cassius thinks back to the day when she announced her second pregnancy. For 3 months he'd been waiting for an opportunity to tell her he was leaving her, and that day the air was right. The sunrise that morning had been a chalky orange, chaotic and clashing against the horizon, so he knew it was that day. But when he arrived at the apartment after work, before he even stepped over the threshold, Hoko had trapped him in a hug, squealing happily. We're pregnant, Cassius. At her words, the room spun. The edges of his vision wobbled. Devastation planted his feet to the ground like gravity, but the possibility of regaining that vibrancy of color in his life lifted his thoughts high into the atmosphere. Torn between anguish and rejoice, Cassius didn't know what to say. The prospect of regaining that light spectrum, his greatest inspiration, was too great of an opportunity to just walk away from. But again, Cassius had no experience describing his color world to others, so he lies. Things got better. Cassius swallows, and tries adding a truth to make the lie more convincing. She was happy, the way she used to be before the accident, and we were getting extra money, so we argued less about it. Extra income. Judgment flickers in Hawthorne's eye. From where? Cassius tells the officer how Hoko found a tenant for the apartment they owned just above their own. The extra income eased their bills and financial burdens. When they first moved in, the property above their own was for sale. So trashed by its previous owners, the landlord didn't have the money to fix it up himself and couldn't rent it out. Cassius had a wad of cash he'd withdrawn from the bank just hours after dropping out of university before his mother could remove it from his account. He offered the landlord 6 months advance rent for both apartments. The deal had been rather easily, actually. Hoko had the place tidied in nearly a month, but unfortunately, it wasn't until the time she became pregnant again someone finally rented. The officer nods. Must have been nice. Lucky you scrounged away with some of your money before your mom found out. Cassius nods. He knew once he officially dropped from the university and personally informed his father he would not be taking over the family business, his mother would be the first to withdraw his trust fund money and have Cassius be written out of both of their wills. Tell me something, Cassius. If things got better... The officer leans closer. If things got better, How did you end up here at the station today with a dead girlfriend? Cash's fist clenches and unclenches like a dying heartbeat. Things didn't stay better. They rarely do. The officer circles Cassius the way a vulture circles a carcass. What happened? Cassius treads on his words with caution. No one else was happy about the new pregnancy. Her best friend ignored her for weeks after she told her, and her mother told her she didn't have a daughter and hung up on her. She started complaining about morning sickness, said it was haunting her, felt sick all the time. The truth about why things didn't stay better. The laughter haunted the second pregnancy, haunted me. Cassius hardly remembers the day Hoko called her parents and Tess, because the memory of the laughter overpowered him that day, but the night before was a night Cassius remembers easily. It was the second night of his torture, when the shadows first appeared. He sat in his studio, frantically working away at the picture, trying to stave off the laughing, but he still felt, no matter what color he used on the canvas, the shadows in the room grew as the sun died for the night, and he felt the endless pit of black closing in on him from the corners. The thoughts of being swallowed by the darkness made Cassius's heart pound and spread chills over his skin like a frost. Instead of dissipating, the cold chills reverberated across his skin like an electric current, pumping his veins full of warning adrenaline. Soon, the frantic thud of his heartbeat was the only sound he could hear. The shadows at the corners of the room formed into twisted shapes, similar to something human, but disfigured by Cassius's limited range of vision in the unlit room. He told himself it was just the boxes and rags and rolls of tarp scattered across the room creating the shadows, but a feeling more sinister crept up his spine. The shadows grew and towered over him from every corner, eyes watching him from every depth of the darkness. Though he couldn't hear it, he sensed the silence outside his own body was vast. It weighed him down like the ocean. He was trapped in that dark room with whatever was watching him. A shock of adrenaline coursed through him when the shape he had been eyeing in his peripheral vision turned its head and stared at him, the only feature on its smooth face, its rotting, jagged teeth. Cassius took a deep breath and whipped his head around to look at it head-on, but the figure was gone. There was no shadow in its place where it had been standing. He knew he hadn't imagined it, though. The laughter suddenly grew to a deafening volume, filling his head with a static, a child's laughter, somehow aged over 1,000 years, neither distinctively male nor female, resounding through the room. The shadow at the corner of Cassius's other eye shifted, from formless to solid, and he slowly turned to face it. It was short and childlike in size, but its eyes were fathomless. Where its lips should have been, instead was a gored, bloody mess, and no longer a jaw, with a tongue longer than a cow's stretching from the back of its throat to its chest. Red was the only color he could see, the color of violence. The shadow opened its red, gored mouth and surrounded him, trapping him like a coffin. Why would Hosoko's mother pretend to not know her own daughter? Hawthorne's voice overtakes the memory, and Cassius sits up, the red and bloodied mess giving way to the gray walls and fluorescent lights of the interrogation room as he tries to come back to the conversation. Her parents disowned her when she came to America because she didn't take over the family business. The officer snorts. Sounds like a story you're familiar with. Cassius's father was the CEO of one of the top banks in the nation, so his disownment had made a few paper articles and a couple of side news stories. He has never really cared about his trust fund money, nor has he been content with the idea of having his adulthood spoon-fed to him the way his childhood was. So he was fine with being written out of the Abaddon will. But whether or not you get the money, you still have a name to uphold. That must have been why your mother got involved. The mere mention of Cassius's mother makes him feel like his stomach is full of maggots. Thinking of her snakeskin shoes and purse almost makes him heave. What do you mean? The officer gestures to the papers on the table, and Cassius finds the next highlighted passage. The sound of her staccato approach makes me grind my teeth so hard they crack. She oozes a sticky Gucci draped shell of sugar, but underneath she is a black, rotting cavity. Her teeth are a sickly yellow, and she has the money to whiten them, but all she sees is the Chanel lipstick shade she hides them with. Even her triplet knock sounds civil. 1, 2, 3. But threes and monsters and cavities aren't civil. I open the door and avoid her eyes. With every step, arrogance echoes off the wooden floors. Stomp, stomp, stomp. How appropriate. They're made of snakeskin. She removes her sunglasses and scans the room, lips pursed like she's afraid she'll inhale minimum wage. I can see why you've chose this apartment. It's small and insignificant, much like yourself. She spits her brand of venom, and so I spit mine, and it lands right on her snakeskin heels. I wait for the stings of her fangs. Instead, she rifles through her bag and hands me a slip of paper. I stare at her, unfazed. Of course you wouldn't know what this is. She sneers, rolling her eyes. Pointing at the paper, she enunciates so harshly her words sound like hissing. This is a check, Hoko. It's like money. She looks at me like she expects me to bow and kiss her feet, but when she realizes I'm not biting, she says, This check is enough for you to live lavishly for a year, and you will receive one every year for the rest of your life, courtesy of me. But you must keep your part of the deal. She leans in closer. Her venom smells like greed. You must disappear. Never try to see or contact Cassius ever again. He'll see your game, come home, and you won't ruin my family. I stare at the floor, past the numbers, imagining my dead child's face, even though I never saw him before the nurses took him away. I can feel his unrested soul pulsing with hatred. He despises her. I can almost feel his hand over mine, gripping the piece of paper. I smile at Cassius's mother, like I'm agreeing. She smiles back, taking the bait. You have 1 week to disappear. She turns to leave, and just before she crosses the threshold, my hands go to work. Shred, rip, tear. The sound of paper as it falls to the ground. Insignificant. She turns and looks at me, the color draining from her face. My child's unrested soul smiles at me. Her loss of control is my bliss. She can't have Cassius. He's mine. Cassius lets go of the breath he's been holding. She never told me about my mother trying to pay her off. She said my mother gave her a letter for me, but that was all. Letter? Cassius nods. Just her kindly telling me what an awful disappointment of a son I was, and how she was going away to our summer house in Cancun to clear her mind if my father noticed her absence and tried to call me. After a few contemplative moments of silence, the officer continues. So, things still got worse. Cassius clenches his fists beneath the table so hard his nails feel like they're biting into his flesh. Hoko said she was having nightmares. I think the guilt from losing the first child was eating away at her. That and the stress of dealing with the new tenants. It smelled like they hadn't taken out their trash in weeks, constantly. Made us both sick. She promised she would go up and talk to them about it one night, but she got distracted with making dinner, so she didn't go until I already locked myself in my studio for the night. Did she cook often? Cassius finds this question odd, but nods. She cooked all the time. It kept her mind off her job. Hoko said she was squeamish, but she didn't want to quit because she was afraid she wouldn't be able to find another job. She sterilized the surgery rooms during C-sections, making sure they stayed spotless to ensure a safe delivery. She said all of the blood and watching the doctors cut into the flesh gave her nightmares. She was particularly focused that night because she was trying out a new recipe, something that would cure her morning sickness or something. What was this cure, if you don't mind me asking? Cassius tries to remember the one time Hoko explained it. He found that if he swished the stew in his mouth, the sound almost drowned out the laughter. On top of that, his other senses were being assaulted by the smell from upstairs. The yellow broth triggers his memory. Some sort of veal, Cassius says. She said the calves were raised on a special kind of herb and something about the way it was digested in its stomach and distributed through its body pushes back the acidity in a human stomach when it's eaten. He chews at the inside of his cheek, brows furrowed. Interesting. And she learned that from a friend. Did she learn it from Tessa? What? No, that was from some of her friends she left back in Hokkaido. Tessa was the one that ignored her after she became pregnant again. It must have bothered Hoko, her best friend, ignoring her. They tried to make up. Cassius remembers a day marked on the calendar, circled with a red marker. The word Tess next to a smiley face. Hoko was 6 months along, I think. Her stomach was pretty big at that point. She invited Tess over for lunch. Seems surprised Tess even agreed to it. Excited, too. Something Cassius says makes the officer's eye twitch, but Cassius isn't sure what. He gestures to the papers again. Turn 2 pages. Next highlighted passage. Cassius ignores his irritation with the officer's avoidance, but reads anyways. Tess came by today, and I knew something was wrong the moment she walked in. Her smile was small, not radiant like usual. I could see her secrets in her flitting eyes. My unborn sensed Tess's hidden words, too. I asked about her family, how her modeling is going. She smiles and nods wordlessly, almost like a wind-up toy until finally her spring reaches the end of its coil and she snaps. Hoko, I think you need help. This is her true intention, spilling from her lips, so I listen carefully, memorizing every detail. I know you're really upset about losing the first child. And yes, Cassius betrayed you. But you can't play games with people like this. You can't keep him like this. Laughter bubbles up from my stomach, and soon the sound echoed throughout the apartment. When I felt her judgmental blue eyes on me, I turned to face her, wiping tears away. You're sad, Tess. You're still in love with him, but you can't accept that he's moved on. A few tears escaped from her shame-rimmed eyes. She reached in her bag and handed me a business card. This guy specializes in postpartum depression, she said meekly. You should call him. I think he can help you. She turned to leave, but before she could, my unborn's hands and mine went to work, ripping the paper to shreds. I can feel the smile of my first child. Tess looks at me now, her face pale, her eyes wide and unflinching. You can't have him, Tess. He's mine. The black and white words tug on too many of Cassius's emotions. He only remembers 2 things from that day, though. The memory of the laughter growing so loudly its echoes stretch into the future, and the smell from upstairs returning. She was angry when I got home from work that night, because the smell from upstairs was back. She went to go talk to them again around 10. I was in my studio until late, though. Did she ever say anything about the tenants? The officer asks, sitting on the edge of the table. She said every time she went up there, they assured her the smell would go away very soon, but they would never let her in. Said they gave her the creeps, so she didn't press them any further. I got used to the smell and stopped caring, honestly. Which he had stopped caring. The pulsing laughter's cruelty fueled him to paint furiously every night, so painfully meticulous. The anxiety that came with the darkness ate away at him, and his sense of reality was beginning to unravel from the core. What did he care what the smell was or what was causing it? He just wanted to be rid of the laughter and to sleep. You just stopped caring? Cassius nods, telling a partial truth. I was tired all the time, and I was sick of that small apartment. Suffocated at work, suffocated at home, and I couldn't stand that stew anymore. But then he saw her again, and he knew then where the color had gone. That same blonde hair, blue eyes, so vibrant she was the ocean and the sky reflecting one another. In the brilliancy of her light, the laughter retreated to a mere manageable pulse. When she saw him, her eyes flitted past at first, but she did a double take and the electricity between them ignites just like the first time. He turned and followed her light, gleefully having his own laugh at the cowering torture in the back of his mind. The officer studies Cassius for a moment before speaking. That was when you began the affair again, with the same woman from before. Yes, but like I said, things never stayed that easy. A couple of months into the affair, she told me she was pregnant. Said it was mine. They met at a cafe just at sunrise, but he should have known something was wrong. The sky was orange. He remembers the pregnant words fell from her lips, and the second they touched Cassius's ears, the laughter broke from its chains, blasting his eardrums louder than ever. It was his punishment, Cassius realized. The laughter's punishment because he had ignored his urges to paint for around a month. He walked away, but the laughter didn't dim, and from that night on, his nightmares were consumed by laughing children with no jaws, their waggling tongues mocking him. The officer stares at the floor for a while, silent before asking, Mr. Abaddon, did you misplace your phone this morning? Cassius nods, confused. Before he can ask how he knows that, the officer reaches under the table and pulls out a large plastic bag with a tag attached labeled Evidence. He drops the bag in front of Cassius, and sure enough, inside is his cell phone. Cassius stares at him, still unsure where this is going. Hawthorne rolls his eyes and says, 4 pages ahead, Mr. Abaddon. Cassius flips to the page and his eyes fly over the copied words. She stands outside the apartment almost every day around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, with her brassy blonde hair and swollen stomach, waiting for Cassius to come out. I knew when the lies began again. The smell of her perfume sank into the walls again, but after only a month the stink washed away. Cassius no longer had business trips or late meetings. He was home at 5:30 every day, but now I know why. The clock on Cassius's phone reads 10:09 a.m. Cassius is at work, and the woman stands there because I told her to, because the phone is in my hand, because I sent her this. I really want to see you. We need to talk. Hoko is out for the day. Come by the apartment around 10. Knock, knock, knock. Unashamed, unafraid of the soul she's torn apart, I feel the spirit of my miscarried smile. He knows it is time. That was the last entry she made, he says, pulling out the chair across from Cassius and sitting. So, what happened from that entry that led to, well, everything, Mr. Abaddon." Cassius takes a deep breath and lets the memory flood from his mouth. He remembers walking through the door to the apartment after work, laughter blaring in his head like the screams of all the damned all echoing at once. Hoko was scrubbing the floor and the room smelled like bleach. Even with the smell of bleach, he could still taste the god-awful stench from upstairs. "I ran out of veal today, and my next order won't be in for a day or so." Cassius barely heard her words through all the whispers and rising static. She picked up the rag and dipped it in the nearly empty bucket beside her, letting it splatter against the wooden floor. "My morning sickness came back. I just can't seem to get it all out of the cracks, and I'm out of bleach." She stood without looking at Cassius, and he didn't look at her when she turned to him and said she was running to the store to grab dinner and more bleach. She'll be back soon. She loves him. Cassius continues staring at the floor. He could just barely make out the outlines of the stain she was scrubbing. The outline is red. The vile smell emanating from the ceiling nearly made him gag. He grabbed the key for the apartment upstairs, deciding he'd had enough and was going to take care of this himself. Not bothering to knock, he inserted the key in the lock, twisted it, and slowly eased the door open. He expected filth, but the room was nearly immaculate. No furniture, save 3 mid-sized tables with white cloths thrown over them, though the kitchen looked like it had been used. Before he could even step over the threshold, the scent hit him like a train. Now that he could smell it clearly, he knew what it was. Rot. As Cassius stepped into the apartment, he saw that under the sheets covering the tables were misshapen lumps. His whole body went numb, like he'd been encased in ice. His blood felt slower, heart pumping like he was taking his final breaths. What small shred of sanity that remained, nearly drowned out by the laughter, screamed at him to just turn and walk away, to not solidify the nightmare before him. But the stronger, less stable part of his psyche controlled by the laughter also had reign over his feet, and he took cautious steps forward. His hand trembled as he lifted the first sheet. At the sight of what was underneath the sheet, he stumbled backwards. Skin, bone, muscle, red and decaying, almost completely rotted away. He realized then that the body wasn't on a table, but a metal gurney. Hoko worked at a hospital which would allow easy access to old, unwanted gurneys in the morgue, where the only witnesses were the ones who had no voice. His eyes flickered just beneath the gurney, and he saw 2 things: a Gucci handbag and a pair of heels that looked like they had been carved out of a viper. The letter. Hosoko's handwriting on his mother's letter. All fake. All a lie. He reached for something to grasp onto, but only came away with another white sheet which tumbled to the ground. Before he could turn away, he recognized the figure under this sheet as well. Even with the hole in her cheek gaping open, he still knew that face. Tess. What was left of her body was covered in multiple ice packs. Cassius slowly turned to the last sheet, shuddering at its color, carelessly stained a bright and fresh red. The laughter crescendos, and the air locked in on his lungs like frostbite. He turned over the very tip of the last sheet, because it was all he could manage. Hair, like gold, faded to gray as he stared down at her. His former light, snuffed out forever. The sudden sound of heavy breathing at the doorway startled him. Hosoko's defeated silhouette stood in the doorway, tears and wetness covering her face and slime. Her bag slipped from her hands, her eyes never leaving his. He felt like he was falling, and suddenly his conscience snapped, like it was waking from a nightmare. But the nightmare was real. Its stagnant smell, Coppery tastes and dissonant laughter assaulted his senses. Hoko's features harbored guilt at being caught. Cassius admitted to himself right then what he'd been denying since he opened the door. There were never any tenants. She did this. Hoko was responsible for everything. The cure had been a lie, her morning sickness a contrived cover for her human stew. Cassius remembered savoring the soup in his mouth, taking extra time to chew the veal and taste it when it was tender, because it distracted him from the internal symphony of laughter. Remembering its yellow color and how he swished the broth around in his mouth to drown out the sends his gut rocketing into his throat. Covering his lips with his hands, he tried to dam the bile rising from deep within him, but it was useless. The vile and acidic taste flooded his mouth, erupting his taste buds and pushed past his lips in a sloppy mess on the floor. He heaved several more times before he was completely empty. His mother, the woman he hated above all else, Tess, his longtime friend from college he'd grown apart from. They'd been inside him. He'd tasted, chewed on their meat and skin. There was nothing left in Cassius to throw up. Nothing left in Cassius at all, which allowed the laughter to grow and cultivate its torture like a weed. Somewhere, beneath all the laughter, he heard a muffled voice screaming. Hoko was suddenly in Cassius's face, tears and snot seeping from her eyes and nose. She looked slimy, gray, dead, paler than the actual dead on the gurneys. Between sobs, she said something. Her lips trembled and she watched Cassius expectantly. That wretched sound shackled him to the floor and twisted his tongue with its piercing howling as Hoko slowly backed away and walked to the balcony of the apartment. He couldn't move as she teetered on its edge and glanced back one final time at him, her protruding gray stomach the last thing he saw before she sailed over the edge. The laughter grew louder and louder as Hoko flew closer to the ground, and when she finally hit the pavement 9 stories below, Cassius heard the sound like it was his own skull cracking in two. But he remembers the relief that washed over him, because with the cracking noise came the end of the laughter. He doesn't remember peering over the edge or dialing 911, or his silence on the phone with the operator. Cassius doesn't remember dragging himself back down to his apartment and shutting himself in his studio. But he also must have done that because he does remember finally taking the whole scope of the canvas he'd been tediously laboring away at for so long. It was the image of the shadow he'd seen the first night the laughter resounded through his body. Red-rimmed eyes, lipless, no lower jaw, jagged teeth and a waggling, laughing tongue as long as a cow's. A demon in a child's cloak. Hawthorne hasn't moved the entire time. Cassius's emptiness from reliving the last few hours is so devastatingly real, he wants to shut it all out. One image stays in his mind, though. Her stomach, like a deflated balloon. The prospect of ever having color again is gone, even if this child hadn't been as bright as the last. But what does it matter? The child is dead. "What was that, Mr. Abaddon?" Cassius repeats what he thought he said only in his mind out loud. The officer hesitates before pulling out a small camera from his pocket. "Mr. Abaddon, I made a special request for the medical examiners to send me the photos taken at the death site. I realize these may shock you, but now that I understand the circumstances surrounding Hoko's suicide, I think it is best you should see these." Cassius takes the camera and scrolls through a few pictures before stopping on the one that catches his attention. In the background stands the outline of a child, but completely black like a 3-dimensional shadow. Then he sees what Hawthorne is pointing to. In the picture, the medical examiner is barely lifting the bottom of Hoko's shirt, revealing something that looks like a bag of white flour. A pregnancy simulator, a belt filled with water made to look like a pregnant stomach if concealed. The realization rips the breath from his lungs like a thief, and he mutters, "She wasn't pregnant?" The officer shakes his head somberly, slowly. "No, she wasn't." He allows Cassius to be alone with his thoughts for a few moments before speaking again. Since she worked in the maternity ward, it would have been easy for her to steal one and fill it with more water as time went on. But I gotta say, in my opinion, the only thing that would have explained how you didn't notice a whole year and a half pass without Hoko giving birth is if there's something seriously wrong with you. Cassius still doesn't know what to say. I think you should read the lines I didn't highlight. Trembling, Cassius scans the words he merely ignored before. I have none of the symptoms of being pregnant, but Cassius must love me so much to stay with me until I can satisfy the soul of our miscarried child. He knows when the spirit is satisfied, we will be able to have children again. I angered the ghost by selfishly taking its life, walking in front of the car. Cassius devoted a piece of his soul to the whore. We both had penance due to our unborn child. Infant misborn spend the chaotic number, 3 moon cycles in the land of the dead before being dumped back here to be given a chance at life again. There are rules and conditions the hungry ghost must fulfill, unique to each soul, but it always involves 3. It asks to consume 3 souls as punishment. Cassius and I must consume the physical bodies of these 3 souls. This will make my morning sickness go away. Cassius thinks it's a physical sickness, but the illness I refer to is spiritual. The spirit of the child I killed haunts me, but once we satisfy it, he can enter into this world properly as a newborn. It will be love the way I never was. I was supposed to stay hidden, like silence, like glances in forbidden midnight embraces in bed before marriage. I had a hushed bump, a hushed birth. I was my parents' best-kept secret, not allowed in the land of the living. My name means secret, but it is easier to whisper than shout. So, I was silent, almost forgotten. But I will never forget my child, not the way my parents did me when I fled to America to escape a land where I felt dead. Despite my hatred, my parents taught me how to properly refrigerate meat to prolong its life before it goes sour with maggots. Being the daughter of a butcher has become my advantage. Cassius's mother didn't stay fresh as long as I would have liked, but I insulated Tessa's cold packs better. It kept her tasting at least decent for a few months. It's even more perfect because the miscarried ghost won't have to wait to be born. As soon as I lure in the woman who caused this mess in the first place, it can inhabit the body of her child, her and Cassius's, when it is born. I've seen the doctors do it 100 times in the operating room, and I have the right tools upstairs. An unfamiliar voice interrupts the silence. A younger officer is standing in the doorway. The hospital called. The baby's going to survive. He's in the ICU. But they said Mr. Abaddon can come see him. Probably be able to take him home in a few weeks. The man leaves. Well, Mr. Abaddon, looks like I'll be escorting you to the hospital instead of a jail cell tonight. I don't understand, Cassius mutters, standing slowly. Hoko wasn't pregnant? She wasn't, he agrees. But her third victim, the blonde, was. 8 months along, actually. Hoko knew how to keep meat fresh, and from seeing the C-sections at work almost every day, she would have vast knowledge on how to perform one. When we found him hidden in the closet, your son had already been cleaned of the blood, but he wasn't breathing easily. We called a bus and rushed it to the hospital about a half hour after he made the 911 call. Cassius feels his face grow colder, like he's back in his studio gazing at the portrait, the demon-child hybrid watching him hungrily with eyes of hellfire. The ride to the hospital is silent, and oddly enough, even the ICU in the maternity ward is eerily quiet. All of the babies are lying in their see-through boxes like display coffins, asleep. A very tired-looking nurse escorts Cassius to a particular box. He stares down at the child, trying to pick out any distinctive features, but he finds none. This child has no color, no pigment to his skin, no inspiration, but at least the laughter has stopped. Just under the veil of silence, he thinks he can hear its tiny heartbeat, a faint pulsing in his ears. Cautiously, he reaches a hand in the circular side opening and touches the baby's fingers to feel its heartbeat. The baby's eyes flutter open wearily, but when they stretch all the way open, Cassius rips his hand from the crib, praying the image is just an illusion, just his imagination. His own heart is so loud it echoes off the walls, but he dares another glance at those eyes. Black, haloed in red. But when the baby blinks, Cassius sees a normal brown. He isn't fooled, though. He knows what he saw. The demon child, the miscarried soul, the portrait in his studio was wearing his son's skin. Staring down at his son, he almost stares into his black aura from an empty eternity, but he tears his eyes away and walks out of the room. As Cassius retreats from the ICU, he can barely hear the officer's congratulations at becoming a father. The pulse he'd mistaken for his son's heartbeat wasn't a pulse at all, but the laughter, ricocheting off of Cassius's hollow insides in an endless loop.